Good evening. I'm Kenneth Green, the Provost at Fairleigh Dickinson University's College at Florham, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this UN Pathways special event. This evening we are honored to have as our guest United Nations Under-Secretary General Cheick Sidi Diarra, who will discuss unleashing Africa's potential. Moderating the discussion will be Dr. Jason Scorza, FDU's Vice Provost for International Education. The discussion will be followed by a question and answer period. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jason Scorza.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special event in the UN Pathways series. Before we begin, there are just a few ground rules to go over. We are videotaping this event, so I would ask that you silence your phones, buzzers, pagers, and other electronic devices, as I will do myself. Secondly, if you do need to move around the room, be aware that the microphones pick up even the smallest of noises, so move around the room quietly, or as quietly as you're able. The format for the program this evening will begin with some remarks from Undersecretary General Diarra. We will then have a conversation between he and I, and then there'll be plenty of time left at the end for questions from the audience. Without further ado, it is my great honor and privilege to welcome Undersecretary General Diarra to Fairleigh Dickinson University.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Provost of Fairleigh Dickinson University, Dr. Jason Scorza, Vice Provost, Global Learning, Excellencies, distinguished guests, faculty members, students, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Cheick Sidi Diarra. I'm with the United Nations, dealing with the African countries, the least developed countries, the small island developing state, and the landlocked developing state. I'm delighted to be here today at the Fairleigh Dickinson University and to be given also the opportunity to address you on the theme, Unleashing Africa's Potential, a topic which I believe is both timely and relevant. I commend the university for this wonderful initiative, which gives us, to us and to the students, the opportunity to engage on United Nations matters. We at the United Nations welcome this opportunity to engage on the United Nations work with this type of audience because we recognize the importance of partnerships with academia in advancing the United Nations agenda. Mr. Moderator, Africa has a formidable human potential, which translates both in terms of production as well as consumption potential. With its 1 billion mostly young people, harnessing this richness would be a crucial element if Africa is to take its rightful place among the community of nations. According to the Population Division of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations Secretariat, 60% of Africa's population of approximately 1 billion, as I mentioned it, is under the age of 25. This represents a huge opportunity for the continent to position itself in the global production and consumption chain. It is therefore important that greater emphasis is placed on the urgent need to provide the youth with quality education, skills, and decent jobs, as well as adequate space for effective political and social participation and representation. We must also be conscious at all times of the enormous contribution that young people can make to the development of their societies. Failure to harness this untapped richness could lead to the generational cycle of instability, underdevelopment, as well as we have recently seen during the Arab Spring in North Africa. In this regard, the African private sector has a central role to play in addressing youth unemployment. There are also significant employment gain to be made if entrepreneurial potential of women is unleashed towards growth opportunities rather than the informal economy and low-yield, saturated sectors. An important cross-cutting issue that holds a key role in unlocking Africa's potential is gender equality. African countries have made progress in promoting gender equality and women empowerment. In some countries, the proportion of women in key policy-making structures of government, such as legislatures, have considerably increased. More girls are going to school, and in several countries, girls outnumber boys in enrollment and completions. Despite this gain, much more progress is needed to unlock women's potential in entrepreneurship through special funds, as well as through giving them greater access to land, credit, and also representation in decision-making. The African Union Commission has demonstrated its commitment to gender balance by ensuring as a statutory requirement that half of its commissioners are women. In Rwanda and South Africa, a large number of women are in parliament. Ladies and gentlemen, according to the World Bank, Africa is well endowed with natural resources, including large pools of water resources and over 200 million hectares of unused but potentially arable land, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa. Africa also has 90% of world cobalt, 50% of world gold reserves, 30% of uranium, 60% of world manganese, 82% of the global reserve in platinum, 55% of diamond reserve, and 50% of phosphate. It also has 40% of the world unharnessed hydroelectric power generation potential. For example, the Congo River, if properly harnessed, could generate enough electricity to power all Central and Southern Africa. With the right policies and an enabling environment, Africa could benefit from the vast wealth beneath its soil. African countries recognize this and have put in place measures to develop the continent's vast potential. The new Partnership for Africa's Development, known under the acronym of NEPAD, adopted by African leaders in 2001, represents a bold vision for Africa's overall economic and social renewal. It rightly recognizes the primary responsibility of Africa in its own development, with the international community providing complementary support. Looking at the first decade of implementation of the NEPAD program, much progress has been made in several priority areas, including in agriculture development, food security, health, and education. Economic growth has accelerated in recent years across a large number of African countries, and this has enabled countries to increase investment in priority social sectors as well as productive sectors like agriculture, health, education, and so on. In 2010, 6 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies were in Africa. The macroeconomic environment have also improved considerably in the last decade. Investors' sentiment towards Africa is steadily improving. For example, before 2009, there was less than 40 Africa-focused investment funds. This is expected to grow to over 100 during the next 3 or 4 years. Mr. Chairman, Africa cannot realize her full potential without building durable peace and security on the continent. Thus, peace and security are a sine qua non for unleashing Africa's potential. Here too, Africa is making steady progress. A number of mechanisms have been institutionalized to underpin efforts in the area of peace and security, including the African Peace and Security Council, the Panel of the Wise, the Pan-African Parliament, the Early Warning System, and the African Standby Force. These important milestones have been critical in reducing conflict. However, further progress is needed through strengthening electoral systems, respecting the sanctity of the Constitution, and putting a lid on excessive abuses of executive power. Furthermore, through the implementation of the African Peer Review Mechanism, known as APRM, African countries are systematically institutionalizing democratic principles, good governance, and rule of law. To date, 30 African countries have acceded to the APRM, and 14 countries have been peer-reviewed. These include Ghana, Rwanda, Kenya, South Africa, Algeria, Benin, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Uganda, Mali, Mozambique, Lesotho, Mauritius, and Ethiopia. This is in an effort to improve economic and corporate governance in the continent through effective macroeconomic reforms and putting in place the necessary legal and regulatory frameworks necessary to ensure good democratic governance. Despite the positive progress in the APRM, Africa still faces massive infrastructure deficit, and this constitutes a serious constraint to its development. Recognizing this challenge, African countries have identified infrastructure development as a key priority, without which the continent is unlikely to reach its development goals. Through the work of NEPAD agency, major infrastructure projects are now underway in power generation, transportation, water, and sanitation. Furthermore, a determined push is also being made to strengthen regional integration through development of highway corridors, such as the one connecting North Africa and the Maghreb region with West Africa, East Africa, Central Africa. In Southern Africa, the Trans-Kalahari Highway connecting Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa has increased cross-border flows of goods and services among the SADC countries. Furthermore, a West African gas pipeline project is being constructed to harness the vast natural resource potential of Nigeria for the development of other countries in the region. And very recently, African Union has established African Union NEPAD Presidential Infrastructure Champions Initiative in order to accelerate the development of regional and continental infrastructure. The initiative comprises 7 regional projects drawn from the AU NEPAD African Action Plan, also known under the acronym of PIDA, Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, it is worth noting that the bulk of national and regional projects have been financed through domestic resources, as well as pooling of funds from different African countries. But Africa has also forged and deepened partnership with other countries, including what we call traditional donors and non-traditional donors. New partnerships with countries such as China, India, Brazil, Turkey, and Russia have been critical for scaling up progress in infrastructure development. Apart from providing support for infrastructure development, the new emerging development partners are also providing billions of dollars in trade and investment to Africa, and this is enabling the continent to make a big push towards meeting the Millennium Development Goals. The United Nations has also launched a number of important initiatives to help African countries reach the Millennium Development Goals. The Secretary General of the United Nations set up an MDG Africa Steering Group to help support Africa in meeting development challenges. On official development assistance to Africa, the steering group suggested that $72 billion a year are required to meet the MDGs in Africa. This objective can be only met fully by implementing the pledges expressed by the G8 at the summit in Gleneagles to double the official development assistance to Africa, and with the support of emerging economies through South-South cooperation. Furthermore, in the context of its program in support of the most vulnerable countries, the least developed countries, the fourth United Nations Conference, convened in Istanbul last May, adopted a number of measures, including urging for enhanced international support through inter alia ODA, which is official development assistance increase, technology transfer, favorable market access schemes, and so on. The implementation of these measures will go a long way in helping the least developed countries, among which 33 out of 48 are from Africa, most of which are in Africa, meet the internationally agreed development goals, among which the MDGs. Mr. Moderator, from these few examples, African countries, continental organization of the continent, of the African continent, and the United Nations are making all efforts to advance sustainable growth and development in order to unleash Africa's potential. However, Africa's potential will remain untapped unless African governments put in place the right policies to allow for development and transformation. But this transformation will not happen until the private sector is fully engaged in agriculture, manufacturing, and services, as I mentioned it. Government must become more investment friendly to attract private sector investment. They must continue to deepen macroeconomic reforms, the foundations of democracy, and ensure the stability that is so critical to growth. It is also crucial that they continue to improve the laws and regulations to create an enabling environment for business, as well as an environment for dynamic rural growth to transform subsistence farmers into entrepreneurs. Rural women hold the key to food security. Any nation that does not provide opportunity for women will not reach its full potential. Significant progress must be made to advance women's empowerment and their status, in particular with regard to access to land and credit. Finally, although investment in development assistance is key, which comes from abroad, nations will ultimately have to take the responsibility for their own development. No nation, no people ever experienced growth that sprang solely from external support. So Africa's development must be made in Africa by Africans for Africans. Africa should continue with the reform processes, and in doing so, change the perception of the rest of the world about Africa and show that Africa is a vibrant and open continent for business. In closing, Mr. Moderator, I want to say once again how much I value the work of your university, especially in allowing me and other fellow ambassadors and colleagues from the United Nations system to come in your excellent institution to speak about a range of topics affecting the regions that I come from. I hope this information will serve to enlighten you on your work and the work of the United Nations regarding the African continent. And I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. You've raised a number of very important questions about the future of Africa.
Yes.
You've said very little about Africa's past. Can we begin our conversation by talking a little bit about the historical development of Africa in the 20th century after the slow end of the colonial period?
Yes, thank you. The years that has followed the independence of African countries towards the end of 1950s and early 1960s have seen different types of leadership based on the historical background of the colonial power. In English former colonies, the fabric of the society have not been touched very much. The reason has been that British did not try to change the structure of the colonies, the society of the colonies. So the chiefs have remained, the structure of the society have remained intact. What British did is just to take the richness of the countries and take them back to England. French was different. The French was more for assimilation of the people culturally, to transform them from their condition of backward-looking people into French-oriented people. So in many cases, that has contributed to destructure the fabric of African societies. This is one characteristic. And the second characteristic is also the kind of leadership that we get in the early years of independence that was characterized by everything that is opposed to colonial power. So we had leaders who had made two strategic choices. One was to have a very strong executive power in order to keep the countries united, because the nation was not still completed. The nation was still in the making. So having a light power would not have helped that. That's the understanding they have. So from there we have enlightened leaders like Nkrumah, Modibo Keïta, Sékou Touré. But we have also autocrats that have held power for a long time. And the second thing is that the second element was, in many cases, they wanted to sever ties with colonial power economically. They wanted to show that they were enough strong to be independent, both in terms of monetary policies, economic policies, and that has brought them to take some very quick measures to exit communities that existed, for example, in the case of France, with French former colonies that are in one monetary community in Central Africa and Western Africa. So countries that have exited these communities, like Guinea, like Mali, went through very difficult times. And at the end, they could not self-sustain. They were obliged to come back, in the case of Mali, into the community, but years later. And they have made sometimes policy choices which brought them closer to Russia, to Soviet Union and China, instead of going towards market-oriented economies, just because of the refusal of the colonial power, which mainly was market-oriented countries. So it has been difficult, and we have seen that Africa has gone through this learning process during the first decade of its independence. Some have succeeded, like Senegal, like Cote d'Ivoire then, some have not. And this has provoked in the early 80s, late 80s and early 90s, a series of coups d'etat and constitutional changes, which has brought the military and the political arena to take power. And this, we're going out of this process right now. We're reaching a third stage of our development after colonial time, which have seen the emergence of new democracies. We're still learning, but new democracies are emerging, and they give excellent example in the context of Africa's history. You take the case of Senegal. Senegal has always been a democracy. It has never had a hiccup in its democratic process except once in 1962. It didn't last long. Ghana is going through a thriving democracy and economy. And there are many other examples like this in Africa today, because we have started this third generation of changes that ultimately would be the best one.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about African identity. You at the UN are in a very unique position of being special representative on Africa, and in effect one of the leading voices of and for Africa within the international system. How does one speak for a continent that is as diverse as Africa is, diverse ethnically, religiously, socioeconomically, linguistically?
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. What we did during the first 3 decades of independence of Africa, at the level of the United Nations, we thought that we could conceive Africa's development project from New York and import it into Africa so that it serves as a template for African countries to follow. It didn't work. We tried it 3 times. 3 decennial programs didn't work. What happened is that when in 2001, leaders like Thabo Mbeki, leaders like Senegal President Abdoulaye Wade and others came up with the idea of coming up with African conceived, developed blueprint on its own development and governance. And they have agreed upon it in 2001 in Lusaka in Zambia. That's what I call NEPAD, the New Partnership for Africa's Development. The United Nations, we were implementing the 3rd program of the United Nations in support of Africa. We have come to the conclusion that it's better to follow Africans' own vision instead of trying to create a vision for Africa. So the United Nations decided to get rid of its ongoing program and to take the African program developed by Africans as its referential document based on which it's going to support and accompany the continent towards its development. So the diversity, economic diversity of the continent is true, cultural diversity of the continent is true, but they still manage among leaders of Africa to meet twice a year to come up with issues that are common to them and try to solve them on a sub-regional or regional basis. And once they initiate this kind of process, what we can do is to support the way they want to go, where they want to go, and providing them with our advice, mobilizing international support with developed countries and emerging countries to come in support of Africa with technical assistance and financial support.
You mentioned in your opening remarks 2 very important groups, and let's take each of them in turn, women and youth. Beginning with youth, who are, this may seem a simplistic question, who are the youth of Africa, and who do the African youth think they are? do they think of themselves as Africans first? Do they think of themselves as Nigerians or as Senegalese or as Ghanans? Do they think of themselves primarily in terms of subnational groupings and communities?
The youth in Africa are like the youth all over the world. Their actions actually transcend the borders of their countries. They are connected to the outside world by the new technologies of communication. And they have more generational bridge with youth from Western countries and emerging countries than they have links with their own older generation people in their own countries and cities. They have their authentic values, but at the same time, they're open to the outside world. And hopefully they're trying to fit themselves with what is positive in others. They have access to 24 hours cable networks.
This is not necessarily a good thing in our experience.
At least it gives them a choice. It gives them different alternatives. And what is happening on the African continent right now, of course, is inspired in part by the local conditions, but it's also inspired by what they see elsewhere through images that they get, through what they read and through what they hear. And this is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It creates a kind of international youth movement beyond borders. And I think that this is something. Culturally, youth are different based on the country of origin and based on the sub-region of origin, based on the language they speak. But in Africa, there are three major languages that we speak. Either French, because of French colony, or English, or Portuguese, or two or three of the languages. So that facilitates also contacts among the youth today, more than among the older generation.
Are youth more likely to identify with youth culture in the West than they are with, I guess, what I was sort of local culture?
They make a combination of both. I think that there are some social values, family values, for which the old generation still stick to the the notion of community, the notion of belonging to a community. But youth are also building their lives based on models inspired by the West. They become more individualistic, and they are more competitive. They want to participate in the global global job market, and they want to attend the best universities in the world. So that makes some to be able to come here, others to go to good universities on the continent when they cannot afford to come to the United States or go to UK or to Canada or to France. So they have both. They have their own culture, but they also learn a lot from abroad.
Your observations, I think, bring us logically to the issue of brain drain, which is the pattern of young men and women leaving the continent for opportunities in education or employment abroad, and then not necessarily returning to their home countries. How do policymakers, or how can policymakers, whether at the regional level or at the national level, hope to resist that pattern?
It's difficult to preclude people from enjoying their freedom of movement. But at the same time, African countries invest a lot of the scarce resources, financial resources they have in training young people who most of the time stay abroad. There are a few things to be done. The first thing is with regard of the host country, the country that receives them. What the United Nations is trying to do is to put a particular emphasis on the positive aspects of migration, what diversity can bring positive to the country, the host country, and also in terms of economic contribution to the host country, what migrants can do. So in return, the United Nations is appealing on to host countries to be more receiving, more hospitable, create conditions for a minimum of rights for migrants and their families. As a matter of fact, we have a convention that has that title. But unfortunately, very few receiving countries have ratified that convention. We have also a policy for what we call transit countries, countries through which migrants move to the third country. These also are called upon to be really more forthcoming in helping migrants when they cannot let them move forward and to at least be hospitable the time they can return back home. The third one being the countries of origin. The strong suggestion we make is to have an orderly and legal immigration towards, and once this is done, agreement can be done between the receiving country and the country of origin on how to manage migration, to make sure that migration benefits to both the receiving and country of origin. But what needs to be done is to develop really policies at the level of the countries of origin, policies that will help retain the brain that has been trained. The best way to retain the brain is to create a suitable environment locally that gives them the scientific environment, the research and development environment, the salary environment that will help these people to get home what they're looking outside, and to make sure also that the areas of their expertise is used in an optimized way to contribute to the development of their country. Once this policy is put in place, chances are that the brain will remain home. There is another alternative, which is the mobility policy, which consists of an agreement between receiving country and country of origin to allow movement of migrants back and forth to come and contribute from time. For example, they can live here and lecture back home during their vacation, or they would take some spare time and go back home, but still keep their environment. This is something that we encourage also. So there are a lot of approaches, but the best way is to have a concerted approach between country of origin, countries that receive, but also raise awareness among the migrants that they have a major role to play back home, and create a secured environment for them, that when they go back home, they don't lose what they got elsewhere.
A lot of youth, not just in Africa, across the world, will say that the political leaders, the economic leaders, don't listen to them, don't want to hear their voices. And I can't blame them, because the youth, they're always complaining about this and that, and the main problem with youth is that they haven't suffered enough. And yet, in all seriousness, youth see things that we can't. How have African countries worked, or have African countries worked, to try to make the voices of youth more constructive in formulating policy and understanding how to unleash that potential of which you've been speaking?
That's a good point. For a long time, youth were seen or perceived by many governments as really a nuisance,
As the enemy.
as the enemy. The reason is simple. Those that were leading the countries did not want to hear a divergent view or voice coming from inside. And the nature of youth is to not agree with what is establishment. And this is the only aspect that was seen on the side of the youth, that people who want things upside down. But the creativity of the youth was not really perceived by decision makers. But this generation of youth and the old generation, the gap is so big because of social transformation, because of new technologies of information, because of the openness on the rest of the world. One young guy or girl can learn in one day what I would have spent 3 or 4 years to learn at school, because it has access to knowledge. They have the creativity, they have the ambition, they have the desire to build themselves. And in doing so, they trust that by contributing to the decision-making process, they can also have their fair share in when the decision is implemented, because their expectations will be taken on board. And this is the aspect that was for a long time neglected. If you take into account the fact that, as I mentioned it, 65% of the African population has less than 30 years, this is something that you cannot neglect. Otherwise, it will come in full force and haunt you. That's happening in many places in Africa. A few years back, a lot of people thought that autocrats in Africa and elsewhere were very well settled, very strong in what they're doing. But a few months back has shown that this was just an illusion. What really stands is when you listen to the voice of your people and you give a chance to your people to participate into the decision-making process. And on this one, we will not go back anymore. Now we're obliged to move forward. If we don't do it on our own, we will be pushed to do it in a non-violent or violent manner. It's better to do it in a non-violent manner and anticipate things, as some countries have succeeded in doing it so far.
Let's move to the role of women in African society, politics, economics. You made the very penetrating observation that the capacity, the unrealized capacity of women in Africa today is colossal. In spite of improvements, we know that relatively few women in Africa hold senior positions, either in the private sector or the public sector. There is one African woman who is a head of state in Liberia. But we also know that women in Africa are more likely to be poor. They're more likely to be victims of crime. They're more likely to be victims of war and civil strife. And yet there is all of this unlocked potential in terms of productivity and in terms of wisdom. Specifically, how does a society grapple with that reality?
Society is making us move on the issue of empowerment of women. the move is very slow. We have a few examples of countries where more than 50% of the representation in the parliament are women. Rwanda is one example. South Africa also have a very high representation level of women in the public life. We haven't reached the level where we should be satisfied with ourselves. In school, primary school enrollment, women have outnumbered the boys now. Young girls have outnumbered the boys now.
Because they're smarter.
Because they're smaller. But the bigger they get, the more it's
No,
becomes
I said smarter, but that's good too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and they're smarter also, of course. It's the structure of the society, that is the traditional society, that's really constitute a hindrance for the empowerment of women. Women represent more than 50% of the population. Women are the food providers for the family. They produce crops for the family. They fetch water, they fetch for wood to heat and cook. And they do the chores at home. They do everything, but they still are deprived of a lot of things. One of the things they are deprived of is access to credit and financing. Another thing they're deprived of is the right to inherit land in many society, African society, including my own country. They're deprived of the right to inherit land. There are a lot of things that the tradition doesn't allow women to do. But this is changing with the new laws that are being adopted by parliament. Executive power is putting in place regulations like for the representation of women. They are putting in place a quota system in many countries by which they create incentives for political parties that bring a quota of women for election to get financial support from the government. And the amount of support depends on the percentage of women being represented on the list of a party, for example. So a lot of measures are being taken. It's slow. The mindsets take time to change, but the new generation of women that is upcoming, and those between the young girls to the 25, I don't see things like this anymore. They're asking for change, especially those who have had the chance to go to school, to be educated. They're claiming the same right as boys. And this is upcoming. They're forcing men and the people in power to change their attitude and to change the legislation. It will take some more years with the remaining of the old generation, but it will change. Between now and 25 years from now, I think the mindset will completely change in Africa about women.
Let's talk a little bit about the Arab Spring. Why isn't it called the African Spring? Egypt, yeah. Tunisia, Morocco, yeah, Libya. All of the most dramatic and dynamic changes, whether they be peaceful as in Morocco or violent as in Libya or somewhere in between as in Egypt, originated on the continent. Why is it viewed, first, why is it viewed as the Arab Spring and not the African Spring? First. Second, why has it not seeped below the Sahara?
I would take up the latter part of your question and say that it's just a matter of time before it reaches Sub-Saharan region of Africa. There are as I mentioned, we have a few examples of the right democracies that are transparent, law-abiding democracies, Ghana, Senegal. There are some that still have a very strong, power, exercises strong power. These countries, unless they anticipate, as Morocco and Jordan did, to take the lead and initiate reforms and put themselves in question and listen to the young people and the population in general, it will not be long before the population start to claim their rights. That might come sooner rather than later. The only thing that I'm afraid of is that leaders who want to cling to power might use the tribal ethnic divide to really try to put part of the segment of the society against each other. And that will be very dangerous. That might lead to civil war. So hopefully we would avoid that. But I believe that the process that has started in Northern Africa, it has spilled over spilling over in the rest of Middle East. But there will be time it will come down to the part of Africa below the Sahara Desert. And hopefully we can anticipate and leaders can propose changes before it happens.
People who are dissatisfied with their socioeconomic conditions are inclined to place blame. It's human nature to do so. Historically, the blame, it seems to me, in Africa has been placed on the colonial powers. Increasingly, again, from my vantage point, it is corruption that is being viewed as the cause of socioeconomic distress within many countries in Africa. Am I correct in detecting this transition? And you're allowed to say no.
No, the blame on colonial power is starting to fade away, to disappear. I don't hear that much anymore. It used to be very vivid 10 years ago when leaders were using that to protect themselves. Their non-performance was attributed to, but to tell you true, colonial power did harm. It did psychological harm to Africa, and it did harm in terms of infrastructure and extracting the riches of Africa and taking them back to the metropolis. It has destructed the social fabric in many cases, as I mentioned it to you at the beginning. It has done a lot of harm, and even after the independence, we still had superpowers mingling with African business, provoking coups d'etats when they don't agree with leaders, provoking social upheaval when there is a leadership that is standing strong in their face. They have done that. And until recently, a country like Comor have suffered so much. It has gone through, I don't even know the number anymore, 14 or 15 coups d'etats in less than 20 years of independence, almost every year. And this was not the local militaries, it was mercenaries coming from abroad, toppling down the leader and putting in place their own people. They have done that 14 times in Comoros. But we don't speak much about this anymore. In Africa, it seems that there is some kind of awakening and some kind of awareness, ownership that leaders have decided since the years 2000 they decided to take up the leadership and the ownership of their own development. And since then, the complaints about colonial power have really been reduced. Now we talk a lot about corruption, the lack of transparency in the economic governance and management. The corruption is due to the fact that the institutions are very weak. Institutions that are supposed to exercise oversight and control on government, on administration, are very weak. It's also due in part to the scarcity of resources. When you don't treat well civil servants, you don't pay well people, the tendency is that they try to get some money some other ways in order to make the ends meet. So the best way they found was to get into this smuggling of public funds and things like this. But more and more countries are taking action against this kind of attitude, because the donor countries themselves are asking for accountability on the part of recipient countries. And the taxpayers in donor countries are asking for impact and result of the support that their countries lend to recipient countries. So more and more official development assistance is based on the principle of result, showing result on the impact of the assistance. And the other way to attract foreign direct investment also requires that you really work on business environment. And working on business environment suppose that you fight corruption. And last year, among the 10 best performing countries around the world in terms of economic growth, the World Bank have stated that 6 of them were African countries. So this is a huge progress. Rwanda has come as one of the 10 best performing in terms of creating a business-friendly environment last year. It has come, if not number 2, it's number 3, something like this in the world. This is an example, very encouraging. Ethiopia is following the same example. Many other countries are coming up. It will change, it takes time, it will change.
You alluded a few minutes ago to the impact of the Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union in Africa. The United States is a very forgetful country. Many of us may have forgotten the Cold War already. But when the U.S. sees a threat, that's when it starts getting interested. And Africa doesn't seem all that threatening at the moment. What is threatening from the point of view of American policymakers is China. I mean, there's got to be 1.5 billion of these people. They're everywhere, economically speaking, and they're very much a force in the continent. So my question for you is, what are the Chinese up to? Should we be worried about them? And what have they got to offer from the point of view of development in Africa?
Africa should be taken as a continent that has a lot of potential, as I mentioned it. But it's also a continent, if we don't address its current situation and condition, can be a threat to collective security beyond Africa's borders. The first illustration I would give you is the illegal migration. America is protected from that because it's too far away. But
we also have moats with alligators in them, apparently.
But ask Spaniards ask Italians, and the island of Lampedusa, the islands of Spanish islands, they will tell you they're totally overwhelmed today because of abject poverty prevailing in Africa, bad governance, people fleeing the authoritarian government. If you take terrorism, terrorism takes hold where the institutions are weak. And you would see that in the Sahel desert, which is surrounded by Algeria, Libya, Mali, Niger, Mauritania. The ACME is Al-Qaeda for Maghreb, is taking hold in that region because of the weakness of institutions. And from there, they can strive around the world. You take the communicable diseases. Poverty brings communicable diseases. It takes very little to prevent diseases, and it takes much more to cure disease or prevent its spreading. So a lot of things that poverty and deficit of governance provoke exist as condition in Africa. Africans do not have the technical capacity nor the financial resources to address all these. That's why it's important that the international community continues to support Africa to get over these difficulties and make it a possible and potential society, striving and consuming and producing society. Coming now to China. China is just filling the space that traditional donors have left empty because they have lost interest in Africa, because they saw Africa more as a burden, as an ever-assisted continent than a continent with a lot of potentials. Most of the former colonial powers have lost interest in Africa, and that was even more pronounced in the 90s when Africa went through what they call the structural adjustment through the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, instructions for the government to suspend social safety nets to the most vulnerable segment of the society, to support subsidies to school, to stop support subsidies to health and sanitation. And that has brought Africa human development indicators backward. What China did is China came to see Africans based on a very old tradition of cooperation, because when China was still out of the United Nations, Africa was the continent that was supporting China the most to get it as a membership into the United Nations. China has built on this capital of sympathy from the African countries. And it has also built on one thing, which was not to get involved in domestic policies of African countries, not to pronounce itself in internal businesses of other countries. They came with very specific offer. They created a forum with African countries. They met every 3 years. They would come with a list of projects that they want to undertake. They would give the amount of money they want to invest in those projects. They would identify countries where they want to do these projects. And then in return, they want Chinese corporations to be able to extract oil, to extract minerals, because of China's need in terms of raw material. So what they're doing is, the first thing they're doing is to build infrastructure, bridges, highways, dams,
based on the needs expressed by the country. They build hospitals, they build schools. They do some capacity buildings based on their own capacities, the level of their own capacities. And more now, they're asking their business people to take, to settle in African countries and start doing small businesses. Import Chinese goods, export things like this. So, but what's important to know, wherever China goes, it signs what it calls a strategic agreement. The lifespan of a strategic agreement is an average of 25 years, not less than that. And during that time, they have access. And they are very flexible in terms of negotiation. A country is not happy with a contract. China is willing to sit down and renegotiate. A country wants a better share in a project. China is willing to sit down and negotiate. Africans do not have this room of maneuver, this space with multinationals, unfortunately. The return for investment, on investment for Africans is very low because it's simple. The minerals are extracted. There is no local value addition. Minerals are exported in the raw condition, processed elsewhere, creating jobs where it goes, creating wealth where it goes, and the products coming from this mineral are sold back to Africa 4 times, 5 times the price of the mineral. That makes it very unbalanced. And the return that African gets out of the investment is very limited. The Bretton Woods institution will say to the state, you cannot take more than 5%, 10% in the shares because the government is not supposed to do business. In the meantime, the local private entrepreneurs do not have the financial capacity to take shares into the business. You take a country like mine, they extract on an annual basis 50 tons of gold. Out of the 50 tons, what remains in the country would not exceed 2 or 3. The rest belongs to those who have invested their money there. It goes abroad. Chinese are ready to discuss. Whenever you claim something, they sit down with you, they explain to you, you explain to them. It's a friendly approach, more flexible, more conciliatory, and they close eyes on the way you govern your country. They don't get mixed into that. They don't criticize. As long as you don't criticize their own system, they don't touch to yours. So you do business. That's the difference.
You're missing all the fun of criticizing each other's systems, but we'll leave that there. Our audience has been very, very patient with us. I think it's now time, though, to hear some questions from the audience. We have 2 volunteers who are going to come and take the microphones. And please keep your hands up. Yes, the gentleman in the middle back, second on the aisle, and then the gentleman further down on that same row. And if we can take maybe 2 questions and then allow the Undersecretary General to respond to them in turn. Please go ahead.
My question is about the Sudan. What's the situation there now in the southern Sudan? Has it just emerged? And is oil still a controversial thing there? And the religious differences? Could you explain and further add to that?
So the first question is about the situation in Sudan. Let's take a question then from the far aisle on the left. Yep, the gentleman whose hand is up.
Thank you, Dr. Scorza. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Question is, you've been calling for a change in the perception of Africa. The question is, on whom is the burden to change that perception? If it is on the Africans themselves, then isn't it time to rethink the role of the African Union to ensure two main points? One, to empower the African continent as a mass and give it somewhat a more powerful bargaining power or bargaining impact. Two, to shield the continent against a possible upcoming imperialism to exploit the resources similar to what is happening now in Iraq and coming soon in Libya. Thank you.
And it goes like this, that what policies is NEPAD and the African Union putting in place to view the African immigrants, not as brain drain, but as brain gain, and as sources for investments?
Very good question. What policies are being put in place to actually capitalize upon the outward migration? In whatever order you would like to take these.
All right, thank you very much. The Sudan issue, we thought that it would have been solved with the self-determination of the Southern Sudan and the creation of the Southern Sudan Republic. It seems that there are a lot of things that are still at stake between the two entities that just split. One of them is, of course, the wealth coming from oil, how to share it. On that, there is no agreement for the time being. As a matter of fact, I was reading a cable before coming here stating that Sudan is blocking Southern Sudan's oil to transit through its territory to the sea through Cameroon, because Southern Sudan has not paid the transit cost for the oil, because the two parties have not agreed upon how much it will cost. So this issue is there. The other issue pending is the status of Abyei. Abyei is a region that is just located at the border between the two, very oil-rich and very contentious place. They have not agreed upon it. There were even some military activity at a certain point, to the point where the United Nations were obliged to deploy 4,200 men and women to make some kind of demarcation between the two forces. Plus, inside of Southern Sudan itself, you have a lot of tribes, ethnic groups fighting among themselves, although most of them are either Christians, or they observe the traditional religions of Southern Sudan. What I can say is that Sudan is a country with very weak institutions, Southern Sudan, with very weak institutions. What needs to be done now is to strengthen the institutions of Southern Sudan. The administration, civil service almost didn't exist. Everything was coming from the north. Civil service needs to be strengthened. There need to be a security sector reform. I have a specialist of security sector reform with me here. And there need to be some kind of mediation process among the different tribes and ethnic groups inside of a country. And the United Nations is trying to support all of this. Would they overcome this? I think they need a very strong support of the international community on the best way for them to manage the oil reserves that they have so far, not to squander it, but manage it efficiently and put it at the service of the people of Southern Sudan. The perception change. The first responsibility for perception change is the one for Africans themselves. That's why I say that they would need to continue to undertake the different reforms that they have started, starting with macroeconomic reforms to stabilize their economies. But what's important is governance issues, economic and political governance. They need to make progress in political governance, respecting the human rights of individuals, respecting the rule of law, so that when people invest their money, they're sure that the money will not be taken away from them. They have to also respect the international conventions that they become parties to. They're trying their best, but they need institutional capacity here also to be able to know exactly what are their commitments and how they can meet them. That's the first thing. The second thing is for Africans to fight corruption, as I mentioned it, to strengthen the rule of law, and to put in place an environment suitable to doing business, to attract foreign, because definitely the domestic savings level does not allow Africans to put in place the basis of a strong economic growth. Our principles in the United Nations is that you should dedicate 25% of the GDP to productive sectors in order to be able to generate growth. And you have to sustain a 7% growth on an annual basis in order to get out of your condition of least developed countries. And no African countries can afford that now. So they would need international support, but they need even more is to have investment, because that's even more lasting than just giving money. So creating a suitable environment for business is something that should be put in place. Now, what do African Union and NEPA do in order to protect? They have put in place a mechanism called the African Peer Review Mechanism. I would tell it about this in 2 words. It's a mechanism by which all African head of state will sit down with a specific country, go through all its governance principles, methods, and everything, practices, and tell them, listen, you are weak in this area. You need to strengthen yourself in this and this and this area in order for you to be able to sustain good governance. It's not criticism for criticism. It's also coming up with proposals of policy measures that leaders can put in place in order to strengthen their governance. They call it a plan of action for improvement of governance. This also envisages to make sure that resources of the continent are managed in a transparent and more sustainable manner. We cannot use the resources as we used to do it in the past. We have to be accountable for the use of the resources. When you sell raw material, you have to show where the money goes. To protect Africa against imperialism, the best way to do it is first to strengthen the capacity of African countries when they're negotiating with private corporations that come to invest, so that their own share of the business increases for the benefit of their people. The second thing that I see is that I personally am not against extracting minerals. What I'm against is exporting mineral in the raw condition. I'm in favor of extracting mineral in a mutually beneficiary manner to investors and to the country, but also processing minerals locally, to add some value locally, to create jobs for young people, to create revenues and taxes for the government, so that the government can deliver on the social safety nets that it needs to put in place to protect the most vulnerable segment of the society. As long as the mineral go out in a raw condition, Africa will not get anything out of it. So let's take it in a more constructive manner. We need investment. We need investment in productive sectors. We need investment that is manpower intensive, create jobs. We need investment that create wealth locally. And we need investment for which the revenues of the government are managed in a transparent manner so that people know where money goes, so that it doesn't benefit only a small elite in the country. Now, migration policies. As you might know, African Union in its Constitutive Act have decided to put in place 5 sub-regions on the continent and to create one sub-region that doesn't have a specific geographic location. Let me explain to you. We have Western Africa, to which your country of origin belongs, Central Africa, Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, and Northern Africa. Each country knows which community it belongs to. But besides putting in place these 5 sub-regional communities, African Union have decided to establish a 6th region of Africa composed of the African diaspora and composed of friends of Africa that are not necessarily of African origin, but that are willing to help and support Africa. And this diaspora is striving, especially in the United States here. They're holding meetings very often with my office, with the United Nations, and we're trying to come up with ideas, with resources, with expertise to put at the disposal of Africa. So that's a way Africa can harness the potential of migration around the world.
Let's take another round of questions. The young man second from the left, right there, and then second from the right in the center aisle, please. Go right ahead.
When it comes to the African Union...
Speak up a little bit.
When it comes to the African Union, I'd like to know, what you think, how could the African Union go and...
NEPAD? No.
How could the African Union go and strengthen themselves to resist Western military aggression as was seen in Libya?
Okay.
And perhaps in conjoined with that, you could speak to the ability of the African Union to strengthen the overall security situation in the continent. And
Yeah.
yes, please.
Hi. You've talked about China's role in negotiating with African states for various infrastructural projects, and you've talked about, you just mentioned now, these sort of ways in which Africa, or with you and the UN, are trying to marshal the African diaspora for ideas on, to use the diaspora as a resource for your growth and development. And to me, a lot of that sounds like the kinds of things that China did. If you look at China in '49, when the country was liberated and the Chinese Communist Party came to power, and you look at African states at their independence, they're pretty comparable as far as socioeconomic development at that stage. But certainly, things have changed a lot for China. So the question that I want to ask, and it's not a unique one, I didn't think this up myself, but do you think that China's economic development actually serves as a good model, a good path, gives a good hint on the things that maybe African states can do for their own economic development? So is China a good model for Africa?
Let's take one last question. You've got the microphone. Yeah, use your own judgment. All right, you're the winner.
Hey, my name is Hassam Shaheen. I'm an exchange student from Egypt. I really want you to clarify anything. I wanted to know anything about Egypt, what's its role in development of African country as we are a part of Africa. There is any project or any progress that Egypt had in the last 10 years or 20 years so that it helped in improvement or development of Africa. That's
So,
what any project or anything, any progress.
So the question is to what extent is Egypt integrated as part of the solution?
Thank you very much. What does Africa do to avoid Western military aggression? I mentioned it in the opening remarks. Africa has put in place a certain number of mechanisms for the prevention and resolution of conflicts that makes it take ownership of conflict and try to avoid to go beyond the borders of the region. They have put in place an Peace and Security Council, which is almost similar to the Security Council of the United Nations that you probably have heard about. As a matter of fact, the United Nations have provided technical assistance in setting up the Peace and Security Council of African Union. It's composed of a certain number of countries that deal with peace and security matters, decide sanctions, decide this and that on the continent. The second thing they have put in place is called the Council or the Committee of the Wise. It's composed essentially of elderly people. The reason is simple. In the African mindset, elderly people are always supposed to be wise, and they always intervene in settling conflicts in the family, in the tribe, in the society as a whole. So Africa took inspiration out of the tradition of Africa and established this council. The former president of South Africa is one of the, Thabo Mbeki is one of the wise of Africa working on the issue of Somalia. They have also established a mechanism called the early warning mechanism that allows to alert the continental organization about potential crisis when factors are accumulating that will definitely end up being a crisis. They try to anticipate by identifying the causes and putting in place a mediation mechanism to prevent the crisis to get worse. And they have also the standby force of the African Union that is still being built. It's actually a military capacity that each African country would put in reserve for the continent for the purpose of being able to mobilize them easily to contribute to a joint effort to address or prevent a crisis with military means in countries. It's not very operational. The United Nations is helping setting up the Chief of Staff office and things like this. So it's in the making, and hopefully, once all these mechanisms become operational, Africans will be able to address issues domestically first before it gets beyond the borders of the African continent. And the United Nations itself is favorable to that. The United Nations tend to be favorable to regional solutions. And what it does, like in the case of Somalia, it gives its blessing by approving a mandate for a specific mission, but the modalities of deploying the mission belong to the region or the sub-region, IGAD or African Union. It intervenes, the United Nations intervenes when it comes to financial resources, because most of the time these regions do not have resources to deploy military, it costs very, very much. The United Nations can contribute or just bring technical assistance to strengthen the capacity of the military or any other deployment in the region. So the trend is mostly that, to strengthen or to just accompany African or do joint operation, like it is the case in Darfur. We have a joint operation of the United Nations and African Union. In Somalia, it's a purely African mission, just supported by the United Nations logistically and financially. Is China a good model for Africa? It's difficult to say. There are areas where China have shown the example. The sustained economic growth, the human capacity building, and the recent experience in reducing poverty, extreme poverty in China. It's unbelievable the number of people that has come out of poverty in China. Would it be a lasting situation? I don't know, but they have succeeded to lift out of poverty more than 200 million people in less than 10 years' time. If Africa can take inspiration from China on that, that's something. China knows how to negotiate with investors. When you come and invest in China, they have requirements. They have environmental requirements you have to meet. African cannot afford to impose that to investors. The second thing, when you come and invest in China, they require you to come with the know-how. It comes as a package. And they give you 5 years to transfer the know-how. If you don't, you go back with your investment. They're not under pressure to accept investment, any kind of investment. Africa can take inspiration out of that. What else? And the capacity of China to build multiple partnerships. Africa is just one of them. Russia has signed with China a 25 years partnership. Russia would provide China with oil during 25 years. Russia would provide China with arable land to grow crops for how many years? China goes in Latin America, it's at home. Asia, it's in the turf. So they have really a good approach of establishing partnerships. And there is, and the best thing about China is that China knows what it wants. It has its own strategy. It has its own long-term vision. I'm not sure that Africa as a continent has a strategy that it has developed towards China. Each individual country comes in with its own projects. But there is no a collective strategy of Africa towards China. So this is something that we can also learn from China. And plus the recent experience of industrialization and the acquisition of new information and technology, information and communication. There are a lot of things that we can learn from China. Agriculture productivity, we can learn that from China and India. Yes. Egypt. Egypt is one of the major players in Africa in terms of contributing to the development of the continent. And there are 6 countries that actually initiated what is known currently as NEPAD, the New Partnership for African Development, which is the blueprint developed by African head of state themselves to project on their development process. Egypt is one of the 6. Egypt, South Africa, Algeria, Senegal, plus 2 more. Egypt was one of them. Egypt is building capacity for Sub-Saharan Africa. It's training thousands and thousands of young Sub-Saharan Africans in different sciences, and they come back home and they serve. They do the military training for armies in Africa. Egypt plays a major role in the African development. And plus, countries that are crossed by the Nile River have very strong ties, particular ties with Egypt because of the specific water resources and how vital it is for the economies and the livelihood of the people of the region. Egypt plays a central role in building Africa, and it has been so since the time of the late Nasser.
Sadly, our time has come. I know there are many more questions. Our time has come to an end. Would you please join me in thanking Mr. Diarra for sharing his experience and wisdom with us?